Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I want to welcome you all to our second GRCOM Global Resilience Commission meeting of 2022. Today's topic is the black sky elephant in the room. How do we talk when and communicate in a catastrophic subcontinental blackout? Let me give you a quick run of show for the day. First of all, I'm Dr. Chris Beck. I'm the Vice President for Policy and Chief Scientist of EIS Council. And I've been with the council for about 11 years. Before that, I was on the Hill on the Homeland Security Committee for about 10 years. And my co-host and our subject matter expert on the EIS Council team is Scott Blevins, who's the Technical Director for Communication Systems. Scott was a senior IT manager for 18 years with broad operational experience managing IT networks and services, IT project planning and implementation, and IT strategic planning and resources development, as well as business continuity planning and implementation. We'll start with some opening comments by EIS Council CEO Avi Schnur, and then we'll be joined by two subject matter experts. The first, Alice Moy Gonzalez, who's the Senior Vice President of Strategic Development at Anterix. Alex has over 20 years of experience in renewables, energy efficiency, smart grid, and wireless telecom industries, with contributions in product and business development engineering. And Alex joined Anterix in 2016 and is currently the Senior Vice President of Strategic Development. She's responsible for planning and executing the company's integrated business and corporate strategy and empowering the modernization of critical infrastructure and enterprise business by enabling private broadband connectivity. We're also happy to be joined by Monica Stoffel, Executive Director for the California Resiliency Alliance. Monica has over 15 years of experience in emergency management and business continuity with a background in anthropology. She leads the California Resilience Alliance, a nonprofit organization with a focus on fostering cross-sector information sharing and partnerships to support local and regional resilience. Following the introduction by our CEO, Avi Schnur, we'll then move into a discussion panel and chat with myself, Scott, Alice, and Monica. So at this point, I would like to ask Avi to please unmute and turn on your mic, and we'll recognize you, Avi, for your opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and greetings to everyone, and a special thanks to our panelists. Each represents a unique and different dimension associated with the importance of emergency communication. I'm actually quite excited about today's panel. The subject is one that I think is very urgent, and I'm looking forward to hearing these perspectives and also, of course, to getting everyone's questions as they come in. I thought I would use my introductory remarks to try to help frame the discussion a little bit. And it would seem that a good starting point is lessons that we have learned from COVID. You know, many, many different lessons learned, but perhaps the most profound lesson of all is how absolutely critical communication is when society is disrupted. That is no less true as the disruption becomes more extreme and as disasters move to the right and become more extreme and eventually reach to the point of a black sky catastrophe, communication is going to be absolutely critical. So, emergency communication. I think it might be helpful to think about emergency communication in an extreme event in two different categories. First of all, of course, there's internal communication within and across an organization. Clearly, for any organization to be effective, that will be needed, and it will need to continue for the weeks at best that a subcontinent scale power outage would last. The other dimension, though, is perhaps even more important. Of course, most major organizations have emergency communication systems. Many of them will, in fact, be capable of surviving and providing connectivity for a significant duration. But the other subject is cross-sector, cross-organization communication between organizations in different sectors and their suppliers, and there the story is not nearly as good. In fact, the title for today's event, The Black Sky Elephant in the Room, the bulk of that elephant, so to speak, is right here. Communication cross-sector in a catastrophe that could last weeks. In that kind of environment, we really will not be able to count on the kinds of emergency communication systems, I should say on the kinds of communication systems broadly that exist. Because although many organizations have their own system, the connectivity between organizations is something that needs to be achieved that has not been put in place in most cases today. What is going to be needed fundamentally is an emergency communication capability that is protected against all the major hazards, is very widely deployed, and could operate for weeks of disruption. And the idea of the black sky elephant in the room is that although when you think about it, obviously, if you're talking about an extreme disaster, the first step in putting all the pieces back together is going to have to be the key decision makers talking to each other, communicating, finding imaginative ways to go pursue the process of restoration and recovery. If we can't talk, we're really stuck. So Although it seems obvious, it just does not come up nearly enough. So the elephant in the room. The other thing that's interesting to think about is, who does this affect? Who needs it? Well, the reality is that by definition, if we're talking about the urgency of communicating in an extreme disaster across all the sectors, private sector, and of course with government and with critical suppliers, what that means is that everyone needs it. All of these organizations need this kind of capability. And what that means is that the thinking, the planning, and the investment to prepare for such a capability, the call for such a capability needs to come from pretty much everyone. So what that means is everyone participating in this webinar today is relevant. Whatever domains you work in, whatever communities you live in, will need this capability just as much as everyone else. So I'm confident that this will be one of the primary topics that we will be hearing from Alice and from Monica and from Scott and Chris as the webinar goes forward. It really is absolutely critical, sustaining and supporting our society and the lives of our communities. If we want to be capable of achieving that in, let's say, if and when an extreme event occurs, having that capability, achieving that capability is essential. We simply will not be able to sustain our society without it, and it does not yet exist anywhere near the level that it's needed. I think there are some very encouraging signs. There are really some amazing and courageous decision makers in different sectors who have taken steps to begin trying out and deploying such capabilities. That needs to expand. So thank you very much again to the panelists, to everyone who's listening and participating today. All of you are very, very important in this dimension. So with that, Chris, back to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Avi. Appreciate that. At this time, I'd like to invite Alice, Monica, and Scott to turn the cameras on and unmute so we can begin the discussion. And with that, I am happy that my colleague Scott has been, he's not just our subject matter expert, but is also going to help me host. So Scott, why don't you get us started with the discussion, please? Oh, Scott, we're having trouble with your audio. Oh, this is a perfect intro to having a communication problem. Scott, give us one more test, and then we see if it reset on you. It sounds like. Let me start off while Scott's getting that squared away. So the first, to frame up the first question a bit, or Scott, do you want to try it without the headset?
Yeah, I'm gonna do it over my other camera. Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah, we can hear you fine now, and it looks good. Go ahead.
Give me just a second. All right. So I guess my first question, where did it go? The critical infrastructure, especially the electric utilities, are rapidly adopting private LTE due in no small part to the efforts of Anterix, who have created groups like Utility Broadband Association to develop a collective effort required to drive the technology. And also, probably more importantly, they've made available the licensed radio spectrum needed to support widespread LTE deployment. So my first question is to Alice. What is the gap or vulnerability that private LTE is hoping to solve? Can you discuss the role that you see private LTE providing in support of Black Sky Communications? And then finally, do you see companies or governments taking the necessary precautions to ensure that their private LTE systems that they're adopting are black sky survivable with things like backup power, security, and EMP shielding.
Absolutely, Scott. And first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much to the EIS Council. Avi, your opening words really took me back, when I was an engineer 20 years ago or so, living through the 9/11, the attack on the World Trade Center, when all of the communications were down. And also shortly thereafter, there was a Northeast blackout, and that's where I live. And a big part of the US, we lost power. And, it really emphasizes what life is like when you don't have access to electricity. The vulnerability on the grid really comes with resiliency, having a resilient grid, and also with cybersecurity. Those are the two key things that I think is really important. And Scott, to your question on, the importance of private LTE and the role that it would play in a black sky type communications, we know that communications is an important facet to a reliable grid. It's being used because all of the sensors, whether it's for data communications or voice communications, for the safety of your field crews, communications is a fundamental part of a reliable and a resilient grid. So private LTE, first of all, maybe let's unpack LTE as particularly, right? LTE is a technology. Many folks use it today. They're familiar with it. Most of their carriers, they literally carry it around in their back pockets. It's an evolving technology. The E in LTE is evolution. So LTE is a 4th generation technology that provides you a higher level of bandwidth, and it also allows you to accommodate greater streams of data. However, utilities have been building out private networks because that gives them a higher level of control on their networks. And it's also a higher level of cybersecurity because it's separate from the public internet. So in a black sky event, think about when you need communications, you need it to all of your assets, you need it to all of your field crews. So the utilities have the ability to design their networks to 100% of their assets and their territories. And because this is a technology that also allows for interoperability, that is going to be an important facet of leveraging that technology. And in terms of, our organizations doing enough to ensure that you have systems that could work in black sky events, Avi also hit on a couple key themes of the coordination between multiple agencies, from utility to utilities, right? They need to communicate when everything goes down, right? So that mutual aid type initiatives is important. But I also think about a recent report or an exercise that was performed by NERC. It was a mock cyber attack on the grid. And as a result of that, they really revealed that there's an urgent need to bolster the grid restoration and communication systems. So we see that there are multiple entities that are talking to each other to solve this very problem. And the ability to leverage private LTE communications is a key facet of that.
Right, and I remember that what you were talking about in the cyber issues with it, and I know in our discussions the other day as we were setting up for this, you'd mentioned that Anterix was really working to develop some enhanced cybersecurity functions within their network.
That is correct, Scott. We actually recently launched the Anterix Active Ecosystem Program, actually recently a year ago. But an offshoot of that is working with multiple parties that provide different technologies on private LTE and on 900 megahertz. So we have developed a cybersecurity collective that we're looking at from the processes to the encryption, the technology that goes onto the LTE system to even make it more robust with respect to cybersecurity best practices.
So Monica or Scott, would you like to add anything else on private LTE and its use or effectiveness within your practice? Start with Monica, I'm sorry.
can kind of maybe take this where we're headed a little bit. One of the kind of broader private networks is the FirstNet on that. And that use of building out that network to really support emergency management communications. And it's something that's really designed for probably 90% of the emergencies we deal with on that. But as Avi mentioned in his intro, this black sky scenario is an outlier. It is not our standard catastrophic hurricane, wildfire. It's a whole nother level. And a failure of FirstNet at its core really would be a serious breakdown of communication capabilities, which impacts all aspects of emergency management. But one of the things that I think we also need to take into account there is that not all jurisdictions are equally integrated into FirstNet. And it's going to be the same case, I think, with a lot of the LTEs. Not all entities have equal integration into those systems, and how they depend on it varies. With the FirstNet example, some of the jurisdictions are highly dependent, and they have not just their police and fire connected in, but public health and hospitals and school bus drivers. And they're really bringing everyone together of the emergency responders and who they identify in those categories into this network. They're going to have a much more significant impact if it fails than those who have very limited dependency on it. They're going to have impact because of failure of other communication systems. For those that have that high dependency, there's a lot of that interplay of have they thought about what to do if it fails? Because it is something that's touted as so resilient. I think that's one of the big challenges we need to look at as we move forward with these technologies is the marketing around it. Often things are marketed as highly resilient, and often they are under normal circumstances. But we need to remember we're also planning for these outlier events. And want to share a quick story about fall of 2019 here in California. And for those of you who live or work here in California, you can probably guess the scenario I'm talking about, the public safety power shutoffs. And at their peak in October of 2019, they impacted nearly 1 million customers. And a public power shutoff is where the utility itself shuts off the power as a wildfire mitigation measure. So proactively, they de-energize power lines so that those lines during critical fire weather don't spark and start a wildfire. As a result, all of the customers dependent on those lines lose power. And those customers are not just homes and businesses, but they're also infrastructure such as cell towers. At one point during that event, Marin County lost over 50% of its cell towers. That's a significant portion in terms of impact to communicating with your population. They ended up going down to printed out flyers put on doors of fire stations, city halls, police stations to talk about resource centers, warming shelters, and that. And so as we look at our communication technology, keeping that spectrum in mind. And also what we can't forget, if we move a little bit further north from Marin County during that same event, Sonoma County lost 30% of its cell towers, but was also dealing with an active wildfire threatening urban communities. After an EMP attack, we are still going to be dealing with hurricanes, wildfires, tornadoes, earthquakes, depending on location and time of year. Those responses still need to be managed in addition to the EMP. It's not exclusive in that sense. So now how do you send in the midst of losing communication capability? Here, Sonoma County had to deal with evacuations, not being able to effectively use the wireless emergency alert system. And so thinking broad spectrum, about what does the loss of these communications mean as we're dealing with other events. And I see in the chat, somebody just mentioned the civil disturbances, and those will definitely be playing in there as well. And all the human caused disasters potentially, as well as exacerbation of other events. But in closing on this question, I kind of want to loop back to not just what if we have a failure of FirstNet, but what if its capacity is degraded and cannot support all of its users, all of its designated and prioritized users? For this type of scenario, if not everybody can be on, who has priority? As Avi mentioned during the pandemic, we saw challenges in identifying essential businesses early during the pandemic. Now imagine needing to do that prioritization without normal communication capability. And so thinking on through some of these levels as well.
Right, thanks, Monica. Scott, any other thoughts on this topic?
Well, again, I think LTE is going to be definitely a player in some of the requirements that we're going to need looking for a black sky. Obviously, it's going to, be incumbent upon the different organizations and users to make sure that they've taken the necessary steps to ensure that it has both black sky resilience capability built in, as well as the interoperability into other systems that'll allow it to expand not just within that network, but also to the broader networks as well.
So I just have one quick follow-up for Alice, which is regarding the private LTE networks, and we're talking about we've touched on the need for cross-sector communications. I'm assuming that the private LTE networks, because of kind of baked into the name, that they are intra-company communications. Have you been in the development process or application process of those that have been for inter-company or inter-organizational communications that would try to help support the kind of broad messaging that Monica referred to as she talked about these emergencies?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chris. We do talk about a number of utilities that they're building out or planning to build out their private LTE networks. And you are right, a lot of the use cases that are mentioned are for what we'll call maybe blue sky type days, right? So you're looking at new IoT applications from your transmission to your distribution systems. It is all hardening your system, but it is looking at multiple use cases that this platform can support. I would say, though, that yes, within those same organizations, there are groups that are looking at what happens when there is, whether it's a man-made or it is a natural disaster. How do your systems operate under those conditions? And a great example of that, I would say, is Southern Link, who has been very forward-leaning on building out their private LTE network. So they built out their network. They actually had a legacy technology, somewhat like a land mobile radio system based on IDEN at the time, and that was becoming end of life. So they saw the opportunity to upgrade that. They had licensed spectrum in their territory. They were pretty unique in that aspect. And they built out that network that supported both voice and data applications. Now, their network supports their company function, which is Southern Company, but it also supports other entities within their footprint, right? Co-ops and other like-minded users of that network. But the great thing is that they have designed their system as along with the other utilities like Ameren and SCG&E, who have the opportunities now as they're building out their networks to look at what use cases they're putting on their network. How do they prioritize communications on it? So you're not necessarily just sharing with my kids that are on YouTube or TikTok. Hopefully they're not on TikTok, but you're not sharing your bandwidth with others. You could prioritize your mission critical applications on those systems. So while yes, there's a lot of intra-utility functionality that is being looked at as the use cases for the private LTE networks, the very important part is how could it also support utility or inter-agency functionality. And the sheer fact that you're using a telecommunications technology, right, that supports interoperability, it really adds to that capability, as opposed to imagine if two utilities are supporting a mutual aid effort and one person shows up with LTE and the other one shows up with a proprietary technology. How do you communicate? And I think that there's another council, the ESCC, Electric Subsector Coordinating Council, that does some of these exercises and supports their members on reliable communications. They had a great explanation with one of their directors that said, with all of the utilities that are looking at private LTE for supporting their various use cases for grid modernization, why not look at how you could leverage that for these black sky and dark sky days? Because when a disaster does happen and you need to dust off the technology and dust off manuals and figure out how to use it, you're already putting yourself at a disadvantage. So the beauty about using this technology is that you're creating the muscle memory also in the event when these negative situations occur.
Excellent. Well, I think you raise a great point about it's first of all heartening to hear that there is some cross sector, or at least in cross company, cross organizational use of some of these networks. So that at least there, it would seem to be then a short step to having really cross sector communications. And you mentioned that they're built for blue sky days at present. Certainly EIS Council's niche mission here is to get people thinking about black sky days, but we don't want to say unless it's a good start. That we don't want to throw out any good efforts to say then now we have some foundation to build from, and having these things in mind is important as we look at what's going to be necessary to really kind of knit our society, or try to hold it together in such a case of an emergency when those communications networks do go down. And Monica has certainly hinted at that when discussing the fact that she and her members have experienced these issues where the communications have been shut off due to lack of power. I just thought that was really, so Monica, thanks for bringing that up. It was kind of like something we planned to discuss. And so this is kind of nice. So to have really smart people that the host just kind of needs to get out of the way. So I saw Alice, go ahead with the follow up there.
You just mentioned something, and I'd like to build on the events that Monica talked about with the PSPS events in California. And also given a good example, right? I think we sometimes would look at the challenges of things that exist, but it's also very powerful to look at what some entities are doing to actually support these efforts. And one in particular, San Diego Gas and Electric, that they're one that are investing in private LTE because they have partnered with Schweitzer Electric to look at a technology that instead of shutting off power, it recognizes when there's an issue on a power line and it de-energizes that line before it drops to the ground, right? So a line would typically fall in less than 1.4 seconds. So in order to detect there's an issue, de-energize it, but also not shut off power to the rest of the grid, right? It's something that one application, as an example, that they're implementing on private LTE. So, when I mentioned, yes, it's blue sky, it's to encourage blue sky type applications, it's to be proactive so that you reduce, right, the amount of black sky days that are there. So I think there's a lot of powerful examples, individual examples of how these technologies are really reducing some of these black sky days. But yes, when there is truly that subcontinental type magnitude of disaster, it's definitely all hands on board, and discussions like this would be really helpful for us to solve it.
Yeah,
Thank you. Go ahead,
You
Scott.
know, you brought up a lot of the discussion there with the cross sector stuff that the electric utilities are doing with the groups like the ESCC and working to start look at some of the black sky scenarios there. And I know that we, as the EIS Council, have been working with the utilities on several ideas and concepts and putting into place some things to help the electric sector with some of those black sky things. One of the other things that we look at the EIS Council, though, is when you look at things at the scale of a black sky, you rely on so many other entities. So even if we can get cross-sector, what we would be cross communications within the electric sector, it doesn't pick up the other groups, such as the water sector, such as transportation, such as maybe government, all these other things that have to kind of come together, and Avi addressed that in his opening remarks, in order to actually truly respond to a black sky. And now, Monica, I think that is an area that you work with closely, right? Can you talk a little about your cross-sector partnerships within those organizations, and what you see as far as their communications planning, both within those organizations and of course across sector?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, cross sector is a lot of what I do. And kind of going back to the pandemic as an example, I think it's an area that showed us a lot of evolution in cross sector partnerships. There were a lot of new partnerships formed because, unlike with wildfire, more the traditional natural hazards where there are established partnerships of here are the response entities, the nature of the pandemic and the duration of the pandemic required the creation of new partnerships, of figuring out, okay, we need to bring in community-based organizations to help. How do we get meals to people who are stuck at home and can't go to the grocery store? We need to bring in the food banks. We need to bring in this broad network of support services for response and recovery. And so a lot of new partnerships between local jurisdictions and either private sectors, businesses, as well as the nonprofit community-based organizations were built and kind of established during the pandemic. The question now is, will they be nourished or will they fade on that? As we move on and kind of the pandemic evolves the way, whichever direction it does, do we keep those partnerships? Do we strengthen those communication channels? Because that is one of the challenges that often exists, is that the communication planning tends to often be pretty weak between entities. They spring up and kind of emerge organically during a disaster, and then they fade again, or it's just a name that stays on a roster somewhere. But the relationship isn't maintained in that way. And part of communication is not just the technology of being able to talk person A to person B, but the understanding of each of the players, of knowing what are the resources, capabilities, skills the other entity can bring, what are their needs, how do we mesh together? And those are not things that are quickly solved on a call. They take time to really develop that relationship. And so those communication partnerships need to be more than just the technology connection or having the phone roster. And also looking with these partnerships during exercises, we often talk about, the communication component, but I have yet to be in an exercise that has truly taken down communication. Regardless of how devastating the scenario is to other infrastructures, a exercise assumption or kind of caveats always that some piece of communication still works. It might be, okay, we're taking phones offline, but email will work, or email doesn't work, but phones work. And so we've never really practiced with these cross-sector community communications, what happens when our communication is down? Do we have the ability to innovate?
Monica, I'd
Yeah.
like to interject there. You need to try, you need to have them play in our EarthX exercise sometimes, because we do exactly that. We take away all their communications and watch them squirm. So I invite people to check those out sometime.
Well, and I would just interject that to Monica, you also mentioned, like, so I agree with Scott that we include that in as part of EarthX. I do also agree that the reason we do it is because it usually is not included. It is included in the way that you just mentioned, that there's always kind of some way to do it. But then also to, I think, reiterate your point about public power safety shutoffs, that you did experience during those, at least in a small footprint, some pretty complete communication blackouts. Am I understanding what you mentioned before?
In certain areas, there was, among the cellular network, there was heavy impacts, and internet was dependent on, did the person have power at home or not? That if they had power at home, they could get on the internet, or if they had cell signal and were able to hotspot on. So it was very patchworked on that.
Thank you. I really appreciate I think this is a great balance between talking about how the technology is being developed and can be leveraged, but also the note that that's not the end of the story. There has to be behind it sort of a social contract. There has to be some understanding, like, who am I going to communicate with? What do I need to do? And there are, it's always a fallback position, but you can have some less than, cutting edge technology that you can rely on, down to, almost a word of mouth, like a social network, or how are we going to pre-position people to be where they need to be, and just have operational plans that they can just execute without even being able to talk to each other at all. So down to, sort of pre-canned actions. But I wanted to pivot over to Scott. I know that this kind of led to my mind into something we were going to talk about, which was those networks. And I've seen stuff in the chat about ham radio operators and HF and other things. And I know that you wanted to get into that. So I wanted to I thought it was a good point to pivot to those networks.
Monica brought up the point of, what happens if FirstNet fails. So in a black sky, we expect most, if not all, national telecommunications network to fail. If this was to happen, we would start to rely on systems such as HF radio, shares, ham radio. I've seen a lot of discussions about those things, Mars, etc., within the chat. What my question is would these systems, if we take the national telecommunications networks out of the picture, would these systems, the HFs, the shares, the ham radios, would they actually have enough capacity to support all of the required cross-sector communications that would be necessary to restore from a black sky? So I guess my first question is to you, Monica. I'm sure your members are using a lot of these technologies, but would you say that they're necessary but not sufficient? And how much capacity do you think that they could provide? Or I guess the better question is, what's the shortfall in capacity that we see there?
So I think definitely they are necessary in the sense that they are another layer of communication capabilities that might be there in a devastating scenario, and they might not, depending on what the infrastructure is and how it's impacted in terms of repeaters and all of that. I think the biggest challenge, and I'll kind of keep this concise, is going to be the diversity of stakeholders that I mentioned that need to be engaged. And many of those are not connected into or have the capability currently to easily connect into these platforms or these devices. And it's not something that you can rapidly scale up and just say randomly, okay, here, you're now suddenly going to operate a ham radio. That there is knowledge that's needed with that. And so it's not rapid expansion to these community groups. It needs to be something that's looked at in advance, and capacity can you really have that many different organizations trying to use these same channels for coordination? It's not just the mass information sharing, but for actual entity coordination. And there's going to be some serious challenges there.
Thanks. That's a great point. I wanted to pivot to Alice. It's just closely related question. So you've talked about the critical infrastructure your critical infrastructure customers that are incorporating the private LTE networks, but I'd assume, at least as part of that like broader communications plan, that HF and shares and ham are at least tools in the kind of backup toolkit. Do you kind of keep those in mind as a part of a broader comms plan?
Yeah, so there is a broad set of communications that the utilities have used. I would say that they have, over the past 30 years or so, they've been building their private networks. The stories that we hear from them is that as a result, they have many disparate wireless networks, right? As they counted up, one started with 14, and as they looked at the new applications that would come online, that would have easily grown to 20 something. So to Monica's point, right, do you have specialists in each one of these to figure out how these technologies work? It is a difficult thing to do, especially, right, with the new generation of workforce that's coming in. There many people don't know what a ham radio is, right? But yes, it does have a place, especially with respect to restoration efforts when everything else goes down. But what we are finding is when the utilities are building these, they're looking at communications more holistically, right? And I think that is something that is changing and evolving, that it is a topic that's happening in the C-suite. It's happening with the state regulatory commissions, right? And that is a big change that we're seeing right now. So they're building these systems with greater resiliency, greater cybersecurity from the ground up. And being, when that occurs, what we see is using these systems in an interoperable way is an important thing to do. The LTE system also incorporates, right, the ability to have push-to-talk technologies, which I think I saw someone in the chat that asked, what about land mobile radio systems, right? Those exist, and I think those have a great track record of being highly reliable. Why? Because the utilities owned and operated those systems. They ensured that they had, great reliability with it, but with private networks, with LTE, they have the capabilities to build it in a very similar way. And what makes it more hardened or resilient is the towers that they install, the backup power that they put to those systems, and that same type of system architecture could also lend itself to the LTE technology. So it is definitely looking at communications more holistically, making sure you have a platform or a system that your personnel know how to use it, especially when there's a disaster event. But with respect to some of the other technologies, I think it's understanding how you incorporate it, and to Monica's point, right, making sure your stakeholders understand how it will come into play when this disaster type event occurs. One last point that comes to mind, Chris, is I think we oftentimes think about voice communications when there is some type of disaster event. But think about when your field crews come in, right? What the stories we've heard is that they have to sometimes get paper copies of reports that are written on. Now that you have the ability to get digital information, assuming that your connectivity is up, right? You have the ability to now leverage these new technologies with greater bandwidth to give you access to more information, that the restoration efforts could happen more quickly. And that definitely is a benefit to the community itself.
And I absolutely agree with you, Alice, on that. When we first started talking Black Sky and restoration from Black Sky, everybody tells us we can do it with voice. Voice might get you there for the first couple of hours to get down the road, but you can't scale with voice. You can only scale once you can actually access that data capability. And due to how extensive the restoration efforts are going to have to be. I think we're just setting ourselves up for failure if we think we can just totally rely on voice to do it. It's not going to happen. Oh, let's see here.
Good point, Scott. I was gonna ask you. So we've talked about HF, about shares, about ham, and definitely about there's one more we haven't touched base on which is I know you wanted to talk a bit, at least bring up with our folks here about satellites. So I wanted to just go ahead.
So in addition to, like you mentioned, in addition to amateur radio HF, the other big stalwart technology for disaster communications is satellites. Whether we're talking satellite phones, satellite pagers, satellite data systems that can provide voice, data, video. Now, I personally have always kind of had a little bit of a love-hate relationship with satellites for emergency communications, because while I think the technology is great, I feel from what I looked at in disaster response that sometimes we become too reliant on technology. And I think that sometimes it's a little more vulnerable than we want to think. Take, for instance, this last fall, Russia demonstrated and joined 5 other nations who demonstrated the ability to shoot satellites out of orbit. We had a small geomagnetic storm back in February that took out more than 80% of Starlink's satellites that they just launched. And with respects to what's going on in Ukraine right now, the Russians were actually jamming the Starlink signal. Now, it looks like that they were able to put a software patch in place to get around that jamming. But, you know, satellites are very easy to jam. We know the frequency they operate on. They present a very weak signal, so you don't have to have a very strong emitter to actually disrupt what they're doing with that. So, you know, my question is, are we highly vulnerable because we're becoming too reliant on satellite communications for disaster response? Or on the flip side, with this rapid growth in civilian satellite technologies like Starlink, where we can put thousands and hundreds, if not thousands, of these small cube satellites up there, is that going to make us more resilient? So more resilient or more exposed? So I'll ask my first question to Alice. Are we too reliant on public networks and satellites? And are we more resilient or exposed? And how do you see, how do other systems like public networks and technology dovetail into the work that Anterix is doing with private LTE?
Yeah, Scott, I think very simply, there's no silver bullet, right? I think we like it to be, but it's really going to be a confluence of different systems and technologies. With respect to public networks and also with satellite, first of all, where we've seen the utilities built using public networks is because they previously didn't have access to high bandwidth type technologies. So by default, they used the public carrier networks at that point in time. But the flip side to that is oftentimes where they have assets or where they have people, they don't have coverage, especially in rural areas. So in those areas, you'd sometimes find connectivity via satellite in those regions. Yes, there are technologies that are improving with respect to that, because typically you'd hear about latency issues with the satellite communications. That is changing. But really getting back to why the utilities are building private networks, it's because they're building it out to meet 100% of their area that they cover and 100% of their assets. So they have full grid situational awareness at every single point in time. So the reliance on any public network, right, they don't necessarily have that ability to prioritize traffic on those networks as they would be able to have on their private network. So that's where, you know, by default, they start with building private networks. Yes, if there's an ability to get redundancy as another layer with these other technologies, that is, you know, some of the challenges that groups like UBBA and otherwise are looking to solve, right? How you have that interplay there. But again, the primary type of network that they're building out initially would be their private networks, really for their cybersecurity and for control purposes.
Right, and I absolutely agree with you, Alice, on, you know, that there is no silver bullet. That's, you know, one of the technologies that we're working on here the council addressed that is this technology we call BSX, and it leverages a lot of capabilities to hopefully provide that interoperability in that private connection and be able to interoperate it into what we're doing with respect to the LTE. Chris?
Can I just jump in? Just wanted to give Monica a chance to kind of to put in her her take on the kind of the satellite issue. You have a broad array of stakeholders in your organization, and you're looking at these trying to have these ability to communicate with each other and across. And so you probably have like lots of different levels of interest in this. I just was wondering about, as you look at it and your focus is on this resilience building, is satellites helping resilience? Do you think like perhaps it's, if there's an over reliance on it, is it something that concerns you? You're warning people like, we shouldn't put all our eggs in that basket. Just wanted to get your thoughts from you and your membership.
So yeah, I think there definitely is a high reliance on satellites, but I think some of the biggest vulnerabilities go back to a point that Alice made of it's not just the voice, but the data. And our reliance on satellites often is in ways that we don't necessarily think about. For example, let's use an emergency operations center, the logistics unit paying for response supplies. That's dependent on satellites because financial transactions use the PNT to time and date stamp those transactions. Common operating picture, information that's fed into that often has geotagging using GPS. So our situational awareness has a dependence on satellites. And I think when we think about, okay, what's our dependency and real need for satellites, we think about voice communication. We think about some of the more standard where the satellite connection is obvious, and we forget about these hidden dependencies on satellites.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to remember that full spectrum. Also, kind of going to the voice side of it, on the flip side there, is I know some organizations are moving away from satellite phones for their emergency management teams just because of challenges of use, of you need to be outside in line of sight. If they're traveling around, you don't have your mobile station. Cost of using it, usability of them being trained to know the satellite delay and how do you dial it, because it's not a phone they use every day. So there's some differences that just created challenges that they're moving away from the satellite phones, looking at other alternatives. And so it's a mix on that. I don't think we're ever going to get away from the dependency, but getting some diversity.
Right. I think I would say if the overall takeaway, and kind of moving into the wrap up phase, and I can't believe that an hour has gone by this rapidly. I think we just always feel in these discussions that we're just scratching the surface, but just to kind of say, it seems to me like that it's really important to understand that it's not there, that technology is always can be leveraging, it can be a vulnerability, but it can, you have to look at it as part of a system of not just the technology itself, but of the human networks, of the operational plans. That it really has to be a layered defense where you really to be able to ensure that you have resilient communications within an organization to external organizations that need it, to the public in general. So I'll assume I'm not seeing any violent head shaking. So I hope that's a useful summary. I want to give everybody just a couple of like maybe a last couple thoughts that you want to ensure that we leave everyone with. And I'll go back in reverse order. So I'll start with you, Monica, and then go to Alice and finally to Scott.
Yeah. So kind of tying this up, I wanted to leave people with a quote from Michael Hughes, the acting comptroller of the currency, from his speech at the American Bankers Association this year. Tail risks, low probability, high impact events, by their nature are not well informed by statistics and data. In technical terms, they are not parametric, meaning they cannot and should not be calibrated using statistical methods. In layman's terms, identifying and managing tail risks requires judgment and imagination more than math and computing power. And kind of looping this back to our topic, for an EMP event, while we might be able to model the impacts on electrical grids and communications infrastructure, we cannot model the human element. And I shared an example of the loss of communications from the October PSPS events. And that was just a mere drop in the bucket of the scenario. Complex systems don't fail linearly, they fail exponentially. And because of how tightly we have integrated our systems, the human factor, we need to be willing to imagine that which we had previously under normal conditions thought was unimaginable. And so really opening up on how we're looking at our vulnerabilities. I'll leave that as kind of the closing comment for me.
Thanks. That's a great encapsulation. Thank you very much, Monica. Thank you for joining us. Alice, your closing thoughts, please.
Thank you. It's hard to follow that one, Monica. I love the way that you capture that. For me, a closing thought is these problems take time to solve. And yes, it takes a lot of stakeholders, technologies, and your business operations planning. What comes to mind is a report that NIAC, the National Infrastructure Advisory Council, had put together, which called on, I think, over 150 different agencies to figure out how do you ensure that your critical assets are secured in times of disasters like what we're talking about. And what they definitely, what they leaned on was having a separate communications system was critical for cyber networks. So having it separate, whether it's dedicated fiber, dedicated wireless spectrum, and we do see that organizations are taking heed of that right now and building out their plans both for blue sky, dark sky, black sky days. And I think those are important first steps, but to stay connected to organizations like yourselves, to really think through how these problems are solved at a macro level.
Thank you very much. And we'll be relying on experts like you to keep advising that process as we go forward, as the EIS Council tries to prepare not just communication, but all kinds of infrastructure and societal resilience for Black Sky. Scott, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I'd just like to take this opportunity to invite people to come check out some of what the EIS is doing in regards to Black Sky Communications, especially our BSX program or Black Sky Communications and Coordination Systems. One of the areas we didn't get to touch on that I really wanted to have a discussion about revolved around spectrum. And we're working with a radio called a BNet radio that can actually harvest fallow spectrum in an emergency and apply that to solve some of those bandwidth issues and stuff that I brought up about, HF shares satellite, or are we kind of short on the bandwidth? We're also working with utilities to develop a private fiber network. I think Monica just brought some of that up to be able to push across some of this Black Sky stuff, and EMP hardened fiber network that we can tie these systems into, as well as modifying that BNet radio to fit within our BSX vision to not only operate as along the land mobile radio frequencies, which we've already done, but also to operate in some of the other broadband spectrum that's become available. And we're actually hopefully going to be working with maybe some federal labs and stuff to actually run some tests and stuff against that and see how those things would operate in a Black Sky type environment. So I'll use my last little bit to just invite you to come see some of what we're doing in regards to that.
Thank you, Scott. I also want to I want to thank Alice, Monica, and Scott and Avi for all the remarks today. A great discussion. I want to thank everyone that's on the chat channel. That was extremely lively. So I appreciate my colleagues have been monitoring that. Sometimes we try to pull up some of those questions and talk about them, but we had so much to talk about. So it's luckily kind of in this meta conversation of communications that we had these multiple channels of communications going. So a great conversation in sort of multiple veins. I also want to say a special thank you to someone who couldn't be here today. Our friend and colleague Yossi Schneck had planned to be the third expert panelist, and unfortunately had a death in the family, and is attending to that today. So we want to keep him and his family in our thoughts, and just say thank you, Yossi. We look forward to speaking with you soon. Let me just give a quick sort of next steps wrap up here. So thanks again to everybody. I want to talk briefly about some upcoming events. We'll have another one of these GR comms. They're every other month. So our next one will be on simulation, on digital twinning, multi-corporate simulation to guide Black Sky recovery. So again, it's not just a communications, it's also understanding the complex interactions of all the components that we have to keep at least some level of operation in order to fully recover. Invite folks to join us as members. We have several interesting publications that are available in the members only section of our website, and the membership is still free for the next couple months. So one example of a great resource is our electromagnetic pulse handbook. So that's at our website. Please visit us, eiscouncil.org. You can also email us there at info. And if you found this interesting and helpful, please share with your networks. We want to get the word out and continue to grow this conversation and this understanding of the challenges we face in a Black Sky environment, which can and probably will happen some point. So we still have time to work together. I appreciate everyone's discussion today. Thank you very much. At this point, I'm going to end the webinar, and I hope you all have a great weekend, and take care. Bye now.